So the first thing I want to do is to get rid of the use of this word immortality, because it's enormously damaging. It's not just wrong, it's damaging. The problem is that not only is that word used already, it's been taken, it means zero risk of death from any cause, whereas, of course, I just work on one particular cause of death, namely aging, but also it's a distraction. It causes people to think of this whole quest as being morally ambiguous and technologically fanciful, which is, of course, a big disincentive to support actual funding for it and getting things done. So that kind of language actually costs lives, and that's why I get so angry about it. So let's not talk about immortality. That's closer. All right. So, first of all, I think it's important to explain that medically, what's going to happen is not to make people immune from aging, but to develop comprehensive preventative maintenance so that people are still aging in the sense that their bodies are still doing damage to themselves the way that any machine with moving parts does, but we will have ways to repair that damage as fast as it's being created. So if we ask the question, has the person already been born who is going to be able to escape the ill health of old age as long as they live indefinitely, then I would say I think there's a very high likelihood that that is the case. I think perhaps as much as 80%. I think there's at least a 50% chance that the first person to be able to do that is already in their 40s or 50s. The way it's going to come about is by the development over the next couple of decades of a wide range of different types of damage repair therapy. These therapies, some of them are already well along. For example, there are many aspects of this which are ultimately types of stem cell therapy. And of course, stem cell therapy is a really big field right now. Many aspects of it are already in clinical trials, so it's pretty close. A number of other aspects are a good deal less far developed so far. They amount to molecular repair, getting rid of waste products inside cells, for example, or restoring elasticity to the major arteries so that we don't get hypertension, things like that. And a lot of those things are going to take a bit longer to develop because they're just not so far along yet. But I think in all of these cases, we have a fair chance, at least a 50-50 chance, of getting there within the next 20 years or so. So then the question is who will receive these therapies, and the answer is people who are in middle age or perhaps a little older. But that means, of course, not as defined by how long ago they were born, but rather what kind of state of health they're in. So people who are already just exceptionally lucky anyway, they're going to live to 100 or 110, those people have a good chance of being able to benefit from these therapies, even if they're already 80 or so at the time that the therapies arrive. So if the therapies arrive in, let's say, 25 years, that means those are people who are already 55 today. Longevity escape velocity is an important concept here. The therapies that we are working on at the moment, and that I think we have a good chance of getting into place within the next 20 or 25 years, subject to funding, are not going to be perfect. Those therapies are going, I believe, to be good enough to take middle-aged people, let's say people aged 60, and rejuvenate them thoroughly enough that they won't be biologically 60 again in the same kind of state of mental and physical health until they're chronologically 90. That means that we have essentially bought 30 years of time to figure out what to do next, to figure out how to re-rejuvenate them when they're 90 so that they won't be biologically 60 for a third time until they're, let's say, 120 or 150. I believe that 30 years is going to be very easily enough time to do that. In other words, that we will be able to keep one step ahead of the problem and keep re-rejuvenating the same people as long as we like. That's what longevity escape velocity is all about. The main difference between the SENS approach and approaches that have been followed over the past 20 years or more is that the traditional approaches involve slowing down the rate at which the body creates damage. there is absolute commonality of understanding of what aging is, namely the accumulation of damage, molecular and cellular changes to the structure and composition of the body that accumulate over time and eventually cause ill health. That's agreed. The question is what to do about it. And the idea of slowing down the rate at which damage is created makes some kind of sense because, of course, we see in nature that there's a variation between species and even a small variation between individuals of the same species in the rate at which damage is created. So you might think, well, we can understand that well enough to be able to think up therapies that will slow it down. But it turns out that that's extraordinarily difficult, and no one's really getting anywhere with that. So the question is there an alternative? And our alternative is to let the damage be created, but to repair it periodically so that it never becomes so abundant that it causes pathology. That, of course, has the additional advantage that it can give big benefits to people who are already in middle age or older when the therapies are first applied. Whereas if you just slow down the creation of damage and you only start doing so in middle age, then you're not going to gain very much. Various different types of damage. And the big breakthrough that helped me to actually create the whole SENS research program about 15 years ago was when I realized that we could classify these various types of damage into 7 major categories, just 7. And the classification was so useful because within each category there's a generic type of therapy that can be used to attack it. So, for example, one kind of damage is loss of cells, cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. And that's exactly what stem cell therapy is there to fix. Stem cell therapy is the damage repair approach to fixing loss of cells. So there are 6 other types of damage, some of them cellular, some of them molecular, and corresponding generic approaches to fixing them. First of all, we need incremental breakthroughs, step-by-step breakthroughs in each of these 7 categories. We need to get them all working well. The kind of like big publicity breakthrough will be when they're all working well enough in the laboratory that we can start taking middle-aged mice and rejuvenating them well enough that they live in a healthy state of health, of course, for a lot longer than they previously would. Once we can do it for mice, people are going to know that it's only a matter of time before we can do it for human beings. So that's where I'm looking to get to. I think that we have a fair chance of getting there within 6 to 8 years from now, just so long as funding is sharply increased from what it is now. I don't really think in terms of doing this in order to save my own life or even to save the lives of my loved ones. I think about it from a humanitarian perspective. And that's actually a very important thing because realistically, what I'm doing is I'm hastening the defeat of aging. I'm hastening the development of technologies that will develop at some point, even if I do something else with my life, right? So then the question is, how much am I hastening them? And even by the most extreme estimates, I could not possibly argue that I'm hastening them by more than 10 years, okay? So what does that mean in terms of my own personal chances of making the cut? You know, not very much really. Either I'm already young enough that I'll make the cut even if I do something else and it's 10 years later, or it could be that I'm too old and it probably is harder than I think it is, and therefore I won't make the cut despite all my best efforts. It's only that little grey area in the middle that I'm actually affecting. So realistically, I can't possibly argue that I'm increasing my own chances of making the cut by more than about 10%, you know, at the absolute maximum. And it's a bit hard to get worked up about 10%. And of course, the same is true for any particular other person I might be thinking about. But if I think about humanity at large, humanity as a whole, the calculation is completely different. There, what we're talking about is 100,000 people dying of aging every single day. And of course, most of them dying after a long period of disease and debilitation and dependency and general misery, right? So, you know, the amount of suffering that I'm alleviating by every single day that I bring forward the defeat of aging is huge. If you calculate it in dollar terms, it comes out that probably you save a life for every pound that you contribute to this mission. That's what it comes to, because basically $1 billion would speed the thing up by about 10 years, and you can calculate it from there. Before I became a gerontologist, I was a computer scientist. And the reason I was doing that was also humanitarian. I was working in artificial intelligence research. And the reason I was because I was a good programmer and I reckoned that I could make a contribution to the development of automation, of more intelligent machines that would be able to relieve us of the tedium of going down mines and serving hamburgers and all this other nonsense that we have to do to keep the world going. Um, as far as I'm concerned, that is the world's second worst problem, the fact that we have to spend so much of our time doing things we'd rather not, rather than doing what we're good at, like enriching each other's lives. The only reason I wasn't working on aging back then was because, even though I certainly recognized that it was the number one problem in the world, was because I presumed that biologists were working on it. I presumed that everyone understood that it was the number one problem and that they were doing their best, and it was a hard problem, so you didn't hear much, but still, they were working on it. And it was only when I was in my late 20s that I started to understand that that wasn't the case, that basically almost all biologists thought that aging was rather uninteresting and unimportant. And I was completely horrified by this, but having come to terms with it, I obviously came to the conclusion very quickly that I needed to switch fields, and that's what I did. Yeah, I'm more of a first things first kind of guy. I look at the problems that exist today in the world and I try to do something about them. And as and when those problems are alleviated, whether by my work or by other people's work, I reevaluate what the problems are and what I'd like to work on and how I'd like to spend my life. So I don't really think about the distant future and what my ideal world is like. My life is pretty good as it is. So a number of people have been looking at the concept of uploading, the idea of transferring people's consciousness to a different substrate, perhaps a more robust substrate like a computer, so that the whole business of the body with moving parts damaging itself as time goes on is simply eliminated wholesale. And it's definitely an interesting idea. It's not nearly as fanciful as it may appear at first sight. There are approaches to doing it, theoretical approaches to doing it, that first of all seem to be technologically not completely impossible, and second of all, they seem to avoid any philosophical issues, like, whether it would really be the same person after the transfer had occurred. So I take it seriously. And in particular, I take it seriously because I recognize that, like any pioneering technology, we don't know how long things are going to take. I think at the moment that we've got a very good chance of developing proper rejuvenation biotechnology, the stuff that SENS Research Foundation works on, well before we get anywhere near the ability to do uploading. But I could end up being wrong, so I'm very pleased that people are pursuing the alternative approaches, because if I can only stay alive by being uploaded and not by being fixed up by biology, then that will be a good deal better than nothing, at very least. The main thing that's misunderstood and misinterpreted is the motivation for the work. There is an enormous tendency, which is fueled enormously by the media and by the film industry and everything, to kind of maintain some kind of emotional distance from all of this. We've spent, since the dawn of civilization, being petrified of aging, so petrified because we know we can't do anything about it, that our only recourse has been to put it out of our minds and find, irrational rationalizations to try to get on with our miserably short lives and make the best of them, rather than being preoccupied by this terrible thing that's going to happen to us. And that's been fine, that's been perfectly sensible until now, when we are actually within striking distance of doing something about aging. But now that we are within striking distance, it's an enormous part of the problem. It slows people down. It means that there's no funding for this thing because everyone thinks that the whole business is about immortality, that it's somehow morally questionable and it's like technologically fanciful anyway, and they just don't really listen. So it's vital to me to demystify this whole thing and to explain that this is just medical research and it's just going to be development of new medicines that keep us from getting diseases that at the moment we can't stop ourselves from getting. I certainly think that everyone in society should be discussing this seriously, whether it's sociologists, politicians, economists, theologians, whatever. Absolutely, it needs to be understood that this is coming. The worst thing that could possibly happen would be if people carried on in this trance, pretending that this whole thing is science fiction, and then suddenly it all happens and there's complete pandemonium in society, everyone is clamoring for it and no one's prepared for it. That would be very bad indeed. So absolutely, we need to educate opinion formers, policymakers, everyone with an influence on the future, so that they are forewarned and can actually forward plan to minimize the turbulence that occurs when people start to widely anticipate these therapies, which could be less than a decade away.